Okay, let's take a deep dive. Today, we're plunging into this really remarkable stack of sources. They give us a front row seat to centuries of turbulent Italian political history, and we're focusing particularly on the dramatic story of the Florentine Republic. These aren't just dry facts, they read like accounts from someone right there, a close observer who saw the power struggles, the conflicts, all those larger-than-life figures shaping these states. We're looking at everything from that really challenging period after the Roman Empire's power faded in Italy right up through the late 15th century. So our mission, we want to navigate this complex story, pull out the most important insights, and see if we can spot those recurring patterns, those surprising moments that define these times. Ultimately, we want to help you understand why this history, well, why it still holds lessons for us today.
It's a fascinating set of material, definitely. And it's also interconnected. What we'll find, I think, is that events separated by centuries often show the same fundamental political dynamics playing out. It shows how certain challenges just seem to keep resurfacing. Let's get into it.
Right. Let's set the stage then. What did Italy actually look like after the Roman Empire started to, well, lose its grip?
Well, it was a period of profound fragmentation, real upheaval, not a sudden collapse, more like centuries of intense change. Our sources point out groups like the Visigoths under Alaric, overrunning Italy after their subsidy was cut off. And they also mention figures like Maximus and Eudocia actually inviting Genseric and the Vandals into the mix.
And this just completely redrew the map, didn't it? Italy and the surrounding regions.
Exactly. The sources list all these different groups settling in, changing the whole political and social landscape. You've got the Ostrogoths in places like Messia and Pannonia, then coming into Italy under Theodoric, the Visigoths, Suevi, Alans, they're noted in Gascony and Spain, the Vandals controlling Africa, Franks and Burgundians in what's now France. And initially, Italy itself was controlled by groups like the Aruli and Turingi. Well, that was fairly brief before others moved in.
So this wasn't just like a change of rulers, this was total disruption.
The sources really stress the immense suffering this period brought. Not just new rulers, but the complete overturning of laws, customs, ways of life, everything. They highlight how even, seemingly small bits of civil discord can totally wreck states. It's a picture of constant instability. We even see mentions of things like the brief appearance of the Slavic group, stopping Justinian from helping Italy when Totila was attacking.
And amidst all that chaos, one institution starts to gain power, the church.
That's a really crucial development noted in the sources. Initially, the popes are described more like ministers, subservient to emperors and kings. But a turning point seems to come with Pepin, son of Charles. According to these accounts, he was instrumental in giving them significant temporal, real-world power. This era also saw the rise of titles like cardinals, originally priests close to the Pope involved in elections, but they started asserting more and more authority.
Okay, let's zoom in then from that big picture to one city that's really central in our sources, Florence. What was its story in these early fragmented centuries?
Well, Florence's history is presented as mirroring Italy's larger struggles, really. It was destroyed by Totila, the Ostrogoth king, and then after a long time, 250 years, the sources say it was rebuilt by Charlemagne.
A city literally rising from its ruins. Wow.
Yes, and for quite a while, Florence just shared the general fate of Italy. A key moment for its own political path seems to be around 1215, after Frederick II died. That period saw a real push for the city to reunite after being divided.
And this is when they try to establish some kind of free government, right?
Yeah, they make a serious attempt, yeah. The sources describe them dividing the city, appointing officers, setting up military structures for defense. There's a really vivid detail about a large car, drawn by oxen, with this big ensign, basically a mobile flag, used as the signal for the citizen army to assemble.
And right away, we see this pattern emerge. The conflict between the traditional elites, the nobility, and the broader population, the people.
The sources are very clear on this. They see this conflict as fundamental, almost unavoidable. The people wanted laws applied equally, to everyone. But the nobility, they wanted to be above the law, essentially to rule over the people. This inherent tension meant nobles would always defend each other against legal action, which just fueled constant friction.
So how did the popular side, the people, try to push back against that noble power?
A really significant reform, detailed in the sources, came from the leaders of the arts companies, the powerful guilds, essentially. To enforce laws against the nobles, they ordered that every new government council, the Signory, had to appoint a gonfalonier of justice, and he had to be chosen from the people. This official got a significant armed force, 1,000 men in 20 companies, specifically to back up the laws when needed. It was a direct challenge to noble immunity.
Okay, so this internal tension, it quickly gets tangled up with the wider Italian politics, especially the Guelphs and Ghibellines.
Absolutely. This is where the external stuff really connects with the internal dynamics. The sources trace the Guelphs and Ghibellines across Italy back to that big conflict between Henry IV and the Pope. In Florence, this wider fight got deeply woven into the existing nobility versus people struggle. Generally speaking, Guelphs often aligned with the church, sometimes representing the popular party and merchants. Ghibellines tended to favor the emperor, often aligning with the older feudal nobility.
And individuals, charismatic or ambitious ones, could really sway things, couldn't they, for better or worse?
Definitely. Giano della Bella is mentioned, a figure who rose up, led, and strengthened the popular government. But the sources also note he eventually just withdrew. He got disheartened by the constant faction fighting and felt unsafe, even after trying to free the city from the servitude of the great, as the source puts it.
The factionalism just seems to evolve, deepen. Then we get the Neri and Bianchi factions.
Yeah, the sources tell us these new factions started in Pistoia, but were brought into Florence. And they just ignited and worsened existing rivalries, especially between big families like the Cerci and the Donati. The picture painted is just constant unrest, the city always on edge, laws losing their power.
And when things got really bad internally, the weaker faction, the Donati, did something pretty risky.
Yeah.
They asked for outside help.
They appealed straight to the Pope. They hoped he'd send someone with authority, maybe even royal blood, to, quote, reform Florence. But it backfired, big time. Well, the Pope sent legate Niccolo da Prato, who it turned out had Ghibelline leanings. He tried to recall banished exiles, which was seen as favoring the opposition. This just contributed to more chaos, and then this terrible fire broke out, destroying 1,700 houses. While some thought it might be accidental, the sources place it right in the heat of this intense conflict.
So Florence was vulnerable from both sides, internal fights and external pressure.
Constantly, it seems relentless. The sources mention the Pope summoning certain citizens, including Corso Donati, to Rome to try and sort out the disunion. Later, you have figures like Guccione della Faggiola attacking Florence, even setting up camp outside the city walls for a time. And while Florence resisted him, the sources really starkly note this dual threat, being harassed without by external enemies like Guccione, and at the same time plundered within by figures like Lando di Gobbio. It just highlights this state of perpetual siege, internal and external.
And this vulnerability, it sometimes created an opening for someone to grab power, even if just briefly, like the Duke of Athens.
Right, the Duke of Athens. He was initially appointed as a vicar by Charles, Duke of Calabria, who himself had been appointed vicar by King Robert. And the sources give a specific financial detail here. The Duke of Calabria apparently extracted this huge sum, 400,000 florins, in just 1 year, double the agreed amount. That kind of exploitation really set a stage of resentment.
How did the Duke of Athens himself manage to actually seize control?
Well, initially he seemed popular. People even displayed his coat of arms on their houses. But the sources say he quickly showed his true colors, became tyrannical, oppressed citizens, made the nobles suspicious, and favored the lowest classes. Maybe trying to build his own power base, separate from the traditional elites. This quickly bred resentment and, inevitably, a conspiracy formed against him.
So what happened when the city finally pushed back?
The sources describe the plot being revealed by Antonio Guadamari. This led to arrests, which clearly panicked the Duke. Then the city just rose up, decisively, led by prominent figures from both the nobility and the people, all swearing to defend their liberty. The Duke got besieged in the palace. The sources give a grim detail about the miserable deaths of his key men, Guglielmo d'Assisi and his son. Ultimately, the Duke was forced out, had to leave the city.
Okay, so they kick out the tyrant. Did that finally bring some lasting peace?
Unfortunately, the sources indicate not really. They mention a great scarcity like a famine hitting the city around that time, adding to the hardship, and the familiar pattern just pops right back up. Factionalism resurfaced. Specifically, tensions flared again between the nobility and the lowest plebeian classes. The struggle for power, for stability, it was clearly far from over.
It really does feel like Florence was just caught in this loop. Conflict, maybe a brief moment of calm, then a new crisis.
That cycle is incredibly clear in the sources. They mention the devastating plague of 1348, horrific losses. 96,000 people killed in Florence alone, they say. And right after this tragedy, new wars, new internal dissensions cropped up. It just shows how fragile the whole situation was.
And new ways to manipulate the system emerged, didn't they? Like the admonitions.
Yes, the amenity. That's a fascinating example of how power tries to consolidate itself and adapt. The Guelphic party, which was pretty strong after Charles I's victory, used this system to basically blacklist people, systematically exclude anyone perceived as Ghibelline from holding public office. By 1366, the sources say over 200 citizens had been admonished, cut off from government roles.
And this wasn't just some symbolic thing, it had real teeth.
Oh, absolutely. The sources explicitly state that the captains of the parts, the guys administering this system, became incredibly powerful. More feared, in fact, than the actual governing body, the signori. Ambassadors coming to Florence would apparently go see the captains first. It was like a shadow government pulling the strings.
But a system like that, designed to keep one group on top, eventually creates its own backlash, right?
It did. The Ricci family, who had actually helped set it up, found themselves getting hurt by it later on. And there's this story of a nobleman, Benci, who had been accepted into the popular class but then got excluded from office by a new law tied to this system. So he teamed up with Piero degli Albizzi, a big figure from an opposing faction, and they started using the admonition system against other people. This ignited the huge feud between the Ricci and Albizzi families, with the Albizzi becoming the head of this sort of new opposition group.
And besides these internal feuds, Florence was also getting drawn into external wars, often tied to the church, like the War of the Eight Saints.
Right. The sources blame that war on the ambition of a papal legate, but it was definitely fueled by Florentine resentment against the church, meddling in politics. During that war, 8 citizens were given absolute authority to manage everything, including, controversially, the power to spend public money without any approval or appeal. And during this crisis, the sources note, those captains of the parts became even more powerful than the signory again. It shows how external crises could shift internal power dynamics.
Let's shift focus a bit to something underlying so much of this. Money and war. Constant themes.
Huge pressures, constantly. The sources really highlight how common mercenary armies were. Like during that war against the legate, the mercenary captains apparently just abandoned their employer because the other side offered them 130,000 florins to switch sides for cash. And the sources note this weird paradox. Cities could easily decide to start a war by hiring mercenaries, but they couldn't just decide to stop fighting whenever they wanted because the mercenaries cared about getting paid, not the politics.
And the whole nature of mercenary warfare directly impacted the citizens, didn't it?
Yes, this is a key insight from the sources. Leaders didn't really gain profit or, build up their own forces from winning mercenary battles. Instead, they just had to keep taxing their own people to pay the mercenaries. The sources state that the only result of victory for the average person was often that it made their rulers more likely to oppress them financially with heavier taxes. So this created a strong popular preference for peace, rather than these potentially ruinous victories.
That perspective on war costs links right into conflicts over taxes, like when they introduced the catasto.
The catasto, yeah. It was meant to be a new, more equitable way to assess wealth for taxation. But the sources reveal something interesting. The proposal to apply it retroactively, to go back and check if the wealthy had underpaid in the past, that's what really alarmed the great citizens, maybe even more than the tax itself. They fought hard against that attempt at judging past wealth for current taxes.
That sounds like a very familiar conflict, doesn't it? Different economic classes arguing over who pays the taxes.
The sources explicitly connect it. They state this resistance from the rich towards fair assessment was a big factor in later internal fights. It shows how money grievances fueled political conflict.
And these financial pressures, these underlying resentments, they also influenced big decisions about going to war, like that whole debate over attacking Lucca.
Absolutely. The sources detail that debate really well. Niccolo Machiavelli is shown arguing strongly against attacking Lucca. It was a Guelphic city, and he pointed out the war would mostly harm the people there, not just their tyrant. He also warned about potential blowback from powerful neighbors like Venice or Filippo Visconti of Milan. Very practical concerns. But despite those cautions rooted in real politics and maybe some concern for the common folk, others pushed hard for war, driven, the sources suggest, by resentment and just the hope of gain. And in the end, Florence attacked, but they failed to take Lucca.
So against this backdrop, internal fights, external wars, money problems, one family starts to really steadily rise to prominence, the Medici.
Yes. The sources introduced Giovanni de' Medici first. They note how he gained favor with the popular classes. And then his son, Cosimo de' Medici, is described in really glowing terms. Prudent, liberal, humane. The sources emphasize how Cosimo built support among all levels of society through his generosity, his approachability.
So his power wasn't initially based on force or holding high office. It was more about influence patronage.
Exactly. The sources state that this way of building influence made things really tricky for the existing government and its rivals. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, who was leading the opposing faction, saw this clearly. He actively worked against Cosmo, warning other citizens that Cosmo was subtly, reducing the city to servitude through these indirect methods.
And this rivalry eventually led to that dramatic confrontation, Cosmo getting arrested and exiled.
It did. Rinaldo, working with Bernardo Guadagni, the Gonfalonier at the time, managed to get Cosmo arrested right inside the palace. They set up a special committee, a Balia of 200 citizens, to reform the city, which basically meant dealing with Cosmo. The sources say Cosmo trusted his innocence but was genuinely afraid of assassination attempts while locked up. But Cosmo's exile didn't last that long, did it?
No, he came back pretty quickly.
Right. The sources note his friends worked hard to bring him back, and they reformed the government in his favor when he returned. And there were consequences for those who'd moved against him. Antonio di Bernardo Guadagni, for instance, was beheaded. There's a particularly striking detail mentioned, too. The Venetians, who had been Cosmo's enemies, actually sent exiled Florentines, who were Cosmo's opponents, back to him as prisoners. They valued Medici friendship more than their own honor, apparently. It really speaks volumes about the kind of influence Cosmo quickly built up across Italy.
Wow. So, while Florence is dealing with the rise of the Medici and all its internal drama, Italy as a whole is still this complex, often violent battleground for bigger powers.
That's the constant backdrop, yeah. The sources describe these really intricate wars happening at the same time, like the fight between Louis of Anjou and Charles of Durazzo down in Puglia, all tied to the succession of Queen Giovanna of Naples. Louis's death totally shifted the dynamics in the south.
And events in powerful northern cities like Milan had huge ripple effects everywhere else.
Definitely. The death of Filippo Visconti, the Duke of Milan, is a key example described. It led to this brief attempt at a republic in Milan. And that republic then appointed Francesco Sforza, who happened to be allied with Cosmo de' Medici as their captain. This just completely changed the balance of power in Italy and seriously alarmed Venice.
Which, predictably, just led to more war.
Yes, the sources detail the war that followed. Milan, now linked with Sforza, and Florence, Cosmo City, on one side, versus Venice and Naples, allied with King Alfonso, on the other. They mention specific things like the siege of Piombino, the hardships, scarcity of the Florentine camp, internal problems during the campaign, and eventually King Alfonso of Naples suing for peace.
The sources also give us these little glimpses into other cities struggling for their own independence or stability.
Genoa gets mentioned, yeah. Its struggle for freedom, revolts against the Duke of Milan. It notes families like the Fregosi and Adorni being involved. And surprisingly, the new Duke of Milan, Sforza, apparently helped Genoa against the previous duke's control. A bit confusing, but shows the shifting alliances. The sources also give a quick mention of the Bank of St. Giorgio in Genoa and its kind of unusual independent governance structure within the city.
And speaking of Sforza, his path to power seems less about loyalty and more about opportunism, shifting sides.
The sources certainly paint that picture. Count Francesco Sforza is described initially allied with Florence and Venice against Milan, but then he becomes friends with the Duke of Milan and eventually maneuvers his way into becoming the Duke himself. The sources point to his indirect and crafty methods as being pretty frustrating for Florence, his former ally.
Okay, so we've seen the Medici rise with Giovanni, consolidate power under Cosmo, but Cosmo's legacy wasn't exactly secure after he died, was it?
No, the sources note there was concern about his son, Piero. He was apparently quite ill and relatively new to handling the complexities of government, and Piero made a decision calling in outstanding debts from merchants that caused widespread bankruptcies and created a lot of enemies for the family. Also, his choice of Clarice degli Orsini, who wasn't Florentine, as a wife for his son Lorenzo. That was seen by some as snubbing traditional Florentine alliances.
And these tensions, plus existing resentments, they all boiled over in the Pazzi conspiracy. That's a huge event.
Absolutely pivotal, and detailed vividly in the sources. The Pazzi family, already powerful and really resentful of Medici dominance, were central. Francesco de' Pazzi, based in Rome, was discussing plans with Archbishop Salviati and Count Girolamo Riario, who was a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. The sources describe the Pope as being, well, maybe not wanting killing, but definitely willing to see the Medici removed from power.
So the conspiracy reached right up to the top levels, including the church hierarchy.
Oh yeah, high-level stuff. The sources describe them bringing Cardinal Raffaello Riario to Florence as a kind of cover, a pretext for the conspirators to gather. And the plan itself was incredibly audacious. assassinate both Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano de' Medici during Mass in the Florence Cathedral, the Duomo.
An attack during Mass in the cathedral, that's shocking. Incredibly bold.
It was. The sources recount the events pretty clearly. Francesco de' Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini were the key figures attacking and killing Giuliano de' Medici. Others went after Lorenzo, but he managed to defend himself and was only wounded. Escaped, basically.
What happened right after in the city? Chaos.
Well, the attempt to take over the palace failed. And the city, despite the shock, seems to have overwhelmingly rallied behind the Medici. Conspirators were quickly captured or killed. The sources give that stark detail. Archbishop Salviati was actually hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria. And Lorenzo himself addressed the citizens, a powerful moment captured in these accounts, which really solidified his position after the attack.
And the Pope? What was his reaction, especially with his nephew involved and the plot failing so spectacularly?
The sources say Pope Sixtus V was absolutely enraged. He issued an interdict against Florence, a really severe religious penalty. But the Florentines, they saw it as politically motivated, driven by the Pope's personal anger over the conspiracy's failure and his nephew's role, not a genuine religious issue, so they reacted defiantly. They actually compelled priests to keep performing services despite the interdict, and they appealed to a future church council against the Pope's actions.
The sources also mention other political assassinations around this time too, don't they? Really highlights the brutality of the era.
Yes, they later note that Count Girolamo Riario, the Pope's nephew involved in the Pazzi plot, was himself assassinated later by a conspiracy in Furli, and Galeotto, the Lord of Faenza, murdered through the treachery of his own wife. It just underscores the constant danger that rulers and powerful figures faced back then.
Lorenzo de' Medici survives the Pazzi plot, becomes the dominant figure in Florence. How did he actually govern in those later years?
The sources describe Lorenzo basically taking control of everything in the city after the conspiracy. He still faced external threats, especially from the Pope and the King of Naples, who were hostile. But the sources really highlight his diplomatic skill. They specifically mention his famous and pretty bold journey to Naples to meet King Ferrante, a move that's credited with helping end the war against Florence.
He really does seem like a pivotal figure, bringing maybe a degree of stability after all that turmoil.
The sources offer a really notable tribute to Lorenzo after he died in 1492. They praise his wisdom, his foresight, his generosity, his patronage of arts and literature. They mention the university he helped establish at Pisa, the buildings, the monasteries he supported.
He's often called Lorenzo the Magnificent. Do the sources kind of reflect that view?
They certainly present him in a very positive light, yeah. Noting his projects were generally successful, while his enemies tended to meet bad ends, referencing the Pazzi and other plots against him. The sources highlight his standing with foreign rulers, too, even distant ones like Matthias of Hungary and the Sultan. The Sultan, incredibly, sent Bernardo Bandini, one of the main Pazzi conspirators, who had escaped back to Lorenzo as a prisoner. That's quite something.
And Florence itself recognized his importance, right?
Yes. After he died, he was publicly decreed father of his country.
Hmm.
But the sources add this kind of poignant note. They suggest Florence's fortunes declined after him. Ruined, they say, by her own citizens, and Lorenzo's own wealth squandered by his agents and children. It implies that the stability and prosperity under Lorenzo were really heavily reliant on him, his personal skill, his influence, his unique character.
Okay, so stepping back from all these centuries, looking at this whole stack of sources, what are the really big takeaways? What are those recurring patterns we keep seeing?
Several key themes just jump out really strongly from these accounts. First, that persistent internal conflict between factions, especially nobility versus the people, but later morphing into new political or economic splits. It's a constant force undermining stability, certainly in Florence. Second, the huge and often disruptive impact of external powers. The popes, the emperors, kings of Naples, other Italian states, their interference frequently made internal divisions worse or kicked off costly wars. Third, the whole double-edged sword of mercenary armies. Necessary, maybe, but the sources show them as unreliable, purely money-driven, and ultimately a massive financial burden on the people, creating that preference for peace over potentially bankrupting victories. Fourth, the powerful, sometimes absolutely decisive role of individuals. You see ambitious tyrants like the Duke of Athens, maybe insightful reformers like Giano della Bella, figures wielding immense influence like the Medici, and of course the treacherous conspirators and the Pazzi plot. Individuals could dramatically change the course of events. And finally, I think the sources illustrate a clear cyclical nature to all this. Power shifts, revolutions, and just the profound difficulty of maintaining a stable, truly free republic in such a turbulent environment. where internal ambition and external threats were just always there.
It really is a masterclass in political dynamics, conflict, the struggle for power, the struggle for liberty.
And the perspective seems to come from someone really aware of these patterns. The sources even mention Machiavelli, referencing his admiration for figures like Cesare Borgia, their courage, their cunning, but in the context of founding a new state.
Yeah.
Perhaps contrasting the needs of creating something new with the different, maybe harder challenges of maintaining an existing one like Florence. They explicitly state that knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied. And they emphasize needing critical thinking when you're faced with just tons of information, a sentiment that feels pretty relevant even now, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We've journeyed through centuries of intense political drama, factional feuds, stunning conspiracies, the constant pressures of war, economics, all drawn directly from these historical accounts.
It's a rich, complex, often brutal tapestry,
Hmm.
really showing how ambition, division, external forces, how they constantly shape the fate of cities and states across Italy.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? Thinking about this long, difficult struggle for freedom and stability in Florence amidst all these powerful forces.
It really raises an important question, maybe for our own time, too. If, as the sources seem to suggest, that fundamental human desire for freedom is enduring, it never really goes away. How do societies successfully navigate that constant tension between individual ambition, the inevitable rise of different groups and factions, the need for security, for order? How do you balance all that without sacrificing the very liberty you're trying to protect? How do the successes, and maybe more importantly, the failures of Florence's tumultuous history, inform your own thinking about these challenges in the world today?